Although this is where the story starts to get a little grim, because by the 1st century BC, this is the end of the Roman Republic. Literacy in that republic wasn't greater than 10%, and most of that was clergy, the elites who could afford tutors, and there was an overwhelming majority of illiterate, and we don't have data about who was numerate. That's indicative, I suspect, of not much mathematical acuity, not much numeracy in the Roman Empire at that time. And again, that's right at the end. That's at the fall of the Roman Empire. Literacy declined from there until the 4th century AD. And, in I think 354, it was noted that the Roman calendar was like 2 entire days out of calculation with the sun. In that interim, between the fall of the Roman Empire, 1st century BC, and then the 4th century AD, which is really close to the time, maybe 100 years yet, of the last nominal Roman emperor. In that interim, some interesting stuff happened. So in 221 AD, that was the last time that the zodiac lined up with the stars. That was when we were moving from the age of Aries into the age of Pisces. So at that time, if we looked at a zodiac, and they would have been using a zodiac like this at that time with 12 even signs. So a sidereal zodiac would be oriented to this point. But the important thing to understand is that in 221 AD, the zodiac that was commonly used and the actual stars, the actual heavens, were lined up exactly. And this is already about 300 years, 400 years after Hipparchus of Rhodes had discovered the precession of the equinox. It's a little confusing because Hipparchus, around the 2nd century BC, he was not sure about precession. He thought the earth was still and the heavens rotated around it, and he couldn't figure out why the fixed stars were moving relative to the point of sunrise, the equinoctial point of sunrise. Later in his life, his position seems to have changed, and he seems to have realized that it was the equinox that was moving, but it seems like the damage was done, and Claudius Ptolemy sealed that deal when he supported. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with these names, Hipparchus of Rhodes was credited with discovering axial precession. If you don't know what axial precession is, look it up, look into it. Very important to understand when we're putting together the history of astrology and the differences between these systems. Claudius Ptolemy was like the last great Greek astronomer, astrologer, geographer, geomancer. He was certainly master of several disciplines. One of them was astronomy and astrology. So Hipparchus realized that the heavens were shifting relative to the point of sunrise on the spring equinox. At first, he thought, well, I need to orient the zodiac to that point where the sun rises because the stars aren't trustworthy. Again, later he realized the stars were trustworthy, and it was the equinox that was moving. But Ptolemy, again, around 300 years later, right around that time, 221 AD, he's 2nd century AD. He came along and cemented the idea of a tropical zodiac, or a zodiac that instead of being oriented to the fixed stars like a sidereal zodiac, was oriented to the point where the sun rose. So this is a zodiac that's completely oriented to the fixed stars. Again, this is a true sidereal zodiac. You can see that the size and location of the constellations delineates the exact size and location of the signs. They are essentially the same. Now, a tropical zodiac is going to use, again, that 12 even signs of 30 degrees each, and there we go. So you can see all around we have just 12 even signs. When the constellation of Aries, which you see here in 221, was oriented to 0 degrees Aries, that was 1800 years ago, and axial precession drifts 1 degree every 72 years. So today we've inherited a tropical zodiac where the sign of Aries is actually inhabited by the constellation of Pisces, and Pisces by Aquarius, Aquarius by Capricorn. We're almost a whole sign off, and this is important to understand. It's one of the differences between sidereal and tropical astrology is your sign, your whole zodiacal orientation can change pretty dramatically. I'm going to leave a link to a Kenneth Bowser article. It's a 3-part series on westernsiderealastrology.com. Kenneth Bowser wrote, let's check this out. Kenneth Bowser wrote an introduction to Western Sidereal Astrology, and a lot of this info is from the intro to that book and the tables in that book that give supporting information. A lot of this info is from his article, and the rabbit hole that reading it for the first time kind of opened up for me. So, without getting into the whole tropical sidereal thing just yet, you can see how the zodiac today, this tropical zodiac, is drifting with the precession of the equinox. So again, right around that 221 AD mark, that decision was made, and that's actually the last time that the tropical zodiac lined up with the stars of the sidereal zodiac. At that time, astrology was called, in Greek, something that translates to divination by means of astronomy. So we know not only that astronomical accuracy was important to the practice of astrology, but all the evidence that we have shows us that the ancient Greeks, the Babylonians, and the Egyptians all used sidereal charts, sidereal ephemeris, and sidereal horoscope calculations. So let's get back. Fast forwarding a little to the 6th century AD, post-Roman Empire entirely. We're entering into the Dark Ages. Oxyrhynchus, thank you. That's an Egyptian town, Oxyrhynchus, which was a Greek colony. So in the 6th century AD, astrological calculations that we've recovered from that site were using mostly Babylonian parameters. They were almost uniformly sidereal in their orientation, not tropical, and they were highly accurate. They were really surprisingly accurate. So this was like kind of the apex of Greek astrological practice in a way, because after that, in the Dark Ages, literacy in the West fell. Literacy in the Roman Empire, again, if you remember, was at 10% around the first century, and literacy in Europe fell after that, and numeracy was lower. Now, keep in mind, and this isn't just a matter of, again, today we have these computers. It's amazing. Have the convenience and privilege that people in, medieval Europe couldn't imagine. To practice astrology, you needed numeracy, literacy, you needed basic skills with a quarterstaff, an astrolabe, an abacus, you needed a pen, you needed some ink, you needed paper, you needed a basic grasp of accurate astronomical ideas, which meant you needed a teacher. This was incredibly rare, and even more so given that the Catholic Church basically discouraged scholarship. We're going to fast forward again. So in the 12th century, the 1100s, there was a Greco-Arabic resurgence. People did get interested in the roots of Western civilization. They got interested in Greco and Arabic writings. There was a rebirth of a lot of knowledge, but astrology was still so poorly practiced that by the 1600s, it was entirely wiped out as an institutionally taught subject. It was derided by rationalists and scientists. One reason for this was that they were still using that zodiac that was, astronomically inaccurate. Again, here's the sign of Taurus and the constellation of Aries, and that's just, tough to reconcile for a scientific mind, tough to reconcile for an astronomer. When I say Uranus is in Taurus and an astronomer gets their telescope out and looks at Taurus and sees that Uranus is in Aries, you can extrapolate, the whole thing falls apart. So that was the 12th century. Fast forwarding again, Newton's Principia sparked an enlightenment in the 1700s in Europe, and that was built on the shoulders of Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo. In 1799, the Rosetta Stone was discovered at the mouth of the Nile, and we started putting Egyptian hieroglyphs together. In the 1800s, there was a surge of interest in everything Egyptian. And since then, interest in the roots of European civilization, Western civilization, and reclaiming of the lost knowledge of Egypt, Mesopotamia, through Greek, Latin, and Arabic sources has just increased exponentially. Out of that resurgence, we have scholarship of Joseph Epping, Johann Strassmayer, Franz Xavier Kugler, and Kugler, especially notable, wrote Star Lore and Star Work in Ancient Babylon, and their scholarship ascertains that the roots of astrology in Babylon were sidereal, and not one Egyptian or Mesopotamian chart or treatise on astrology used tropical reckoning. This was a later development, the tropical zodiac that arose out of geocentrism and was rationalized by a Eurocentric or Northern Hemisphere-centric logic around the seasons. The zodiac in Western astrology still reflects the astronomical alignment of 221 AD, and mainstream astrology hasn't corrected this. So in the 1970s, this guy named Cyril Fagan noticed all this. I wore my Irish fisherman sweater in honor of Cyril Fagan today, and he proposed a return in Western astrology to a sidereal orientation. He realized that the ancient origins of the ideas we have about the signs were out of alignment with the modern calculations that people were using to determine their charts, the modern ephemerae, the modern way of plotting a horoscope. And that sidereal tropical debate had already gone on a little before his time, but he was one of the most prodigious and talented astrologers of his time, maybe of all time. And he made the strongest case that I think anyone could have possibly made for a return to sidereal Western astrology. And that debate has gone on maybe for, 70 years. Hard to say really when it started. But people have been aware of this for some time. On a sort of side note, getting back to the Indian, the Vedic astrological system has always been sidereal, or oriented to the fixed stars, where their zodiac is oriented to the stars, just like the ancient Babylonian. The ancient Egyptian I didn't mention much, but that's where we get our idea of deacons. I think the word deacon is derived, but deca is the root, and I say decans. It might be tomato. I'm actually not sure on the pronunciation of decans. As you can see, I use an astrological system that doesn't take the decans into account, so I never studied them too intensely. I never learned much about them. They are, let's go back, they are, if you take the even signs and you take them, they're 30 degrees each, and if you divide them into thirds, you get 10 degrees. Well, there are star groups along the ecliptic that were really important to the Egyptians. Every 10 degrees, the Egyptians would count almost like their own constellation. And as the Earth orbited the sun, every 10 days, they would see the rising of a new deacon in the sky, decan. And that was incorporated into Babylonian, into into Greek astrology, but it's almost never used today. I've seen some interesting charting of the deacons onto the cards of the tarot deck. Some other interesting uses of it. And I've seen some reference to it, like, oh, that's in the first decan of Gemini, the second decan of Gemini, and so on. But people generally use it to mean the thirds. The idea itself came from sidereal astrology. These were actual star clusters. and kind of like the idea of like the age of Pisces or the age of Aquarius got incorporated into tropical astrology, even though the roots of it are completely sidereal, and the only serviceable application of it is happening within a sidereal context. All right, everyone. So I hope that gives a little bit of clarity around the development of the astrology we have today, around the importance of astronomical accuracy that was held by the ancient peoples from whom we get our ideas. The Babylonians are who we inherited our ideas about the star groups from. The constellations that became the Big 12, they did write extensively on those groups. And if you go to Wikipedia and look up Babylonian star catalogs, you'll find a great article on the original constellations, the 18 original constellations, maybe a little bit about what they said about them. If you like Wikipedia rabbit holes and internet rabbit holes, Babylonian star catalogs is a great place to start. All that we know about what makes Leo as opposed to any other sign, what makes a sign unique, gives it its qualities, its properties. Almost all of that came out of Babylonian star lore and star work, astrological tables that started to note these patterns. I think that's all I'm going to say for today. I hope this video helped. I hope that you like the kind of historical perspective. I hope that it puts things into context. And if you have any questions, post them in the comments down below. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.